Hello everybody and welcome to Flock Talk. Today we are going to be going over how to teach your bird how to recall and station. Now I have done a tutorial on this already, but that was 7 years ago, so I figure it's about time that we do an updated tutorial going a little bit more in depth, a little bit more thorough on the types of problems you might encounter and the step-by-step process of how to teach your bird to come when called. Now I do need to apologize. I usually make most of my tutorials with a bird who does not know the behaviors yet, but both of my birds have both already been taught recall. Toto is new to it though, so we are going to use him for this tutorial so you can see a little bit more of that hesitancy and that unfamiliarness with the behavior, but it is going to be a little different than our typical tutorials since he has already been taught how to recall, but we're still going to be able to go through the entire process and show you guys what it should look like. So prior to starting recall, we want to make sure we have two main things down. And the first is going to be having your bird target trained. You can teach this behavior without it, but it does make it a little bit easier and it helps negate some problems. When we are using a food lure instead, what can happen is the bird becomes very fixated on following that reward, and they aren't actually paying too much attention to what their body is doing and why they're earning the reward. When we use something like a target stick, we have a behavior that is fully understood. They know why they're earning that treat, they know what body movements are earning them that treat, and it makes it easier for them to interpret the whole situation and learn. Another thing that can happen, especially if you're working with a bird that is a little bit more fearful while you're going through this or they're new to flying, if you're using a treat to lure them, you are very heavily relying on the reinforcement value of the item that you are providing being greater than the fear or discomfort that they are experiencing in that moment. And when we are doing that, it's very often they will look at the nut that you're trying to guide them with and go, I'm really scared. That thing is not worth the activity that you are asking me to do. Doing a little dance? And they will just stay put instead. And that can cause them to not want to recall at all. When we have something like a target stick, we have the entire reinforcement history. And what that means is that no matter what the situation is, they have a very long memory bank of all the different ways that they've been reinforced while doing this activity. It could be treats, it could be going to a different place. There will be a lot of fun, positive memories around this specific thing that were different every time that they did it. So when you ask them to target, they don't necessarily know exactly what's going to come. They just know that whatever it is, it's going to be really good and it's always been worthwhile in the past. So when you're asking them to recall or do something that might be a little scary, it's easier for them to say, oh, I'm going to go touch that stick. It's never steered me wrong in the past. It's always been worth it. And they'll be really eager to do it, even if they're a little bit worried about it. The other thing we really want to make sure we have in place is a very solid step up. And it doesn't have to be the most flashy, fancy step up on the planet. I just want your bird to be able to step up onto your finger calmly and confidently. If you have a bird that's very, very new and they're very nervous stepping up onto your hand, you're not going to want to start recall quite yet because that can be extremely terrifying. Being asked to step up onto a hand, which is something very slow and very controlled, is a lot easier than flying and jumping, which requires them to fully trust that you are not going to move and cause them to fall. It's very easy to start recall too soon. We really want to make sure that they are confident and comfortable, and that as soon as they see our step-up hand, they are excited and running towards it and confident hanging out on our hands and our bodies. When they are at that stage, then I would consider starting recall. So the first thing I'm going to do to start our recall training is I'm going to just do some target training practice. I want to make sure that my bird is very eagerly targeting that stick. They are very excited to run for it, and they are motivated to be moving. I want them to see that stick, have it fresh in their head that it's full of valuable resources, valuable levels of reinforcement, and it's something that they're really motivated to do. I want to see that excitement so that when it comes to me asking them to move somewhere that they might be a little less comfortable with, they remember how valuable and exciting it was to reach that stick the first 12 times that I asked them to. And that will make it a lot easier for us along the way when we are asking them to stretch onto our hands at varying distances that they might not be fully confident going. There are a few different ways that you can hold your treat and your target stick and your clicker all at once in order to make everything here work. The first option is, if I move this guy here, to hold the treat between your thumb and middle finger and then use your pointer to be your recall hand, and then your other hand would have your clicker and the target stick clenched into this hand. And the other option would be to have the clicker in your recall hand and then have the treat between your pointer finger and your thumb. Very nice, Wings, good boy. And then the target stick is just being held between the rest of the fingers in there. So it's a matter of whichever is going to work best for you. I usually find clicker in the hand works best because if you have the treat in your hand instead, when you recall them, you have to rotate your hand in order to deliver that treat to their mouth, and that can be enough to cause them to feel unbalanced and a little bit more nervous going forwards. So if I recall him that way, I have to tip him, and he's confident, so he's fine, but some birds might find that to be a little bit more nerve-wracking. So it just depends on the bird that you're working with. So typically for birds that are more nervous, I find that having the clicker in the recall hand and the treats in the target stick hand to be a lot easier for them to navigate with. But if you have a very noise-sensitive bird, then obviously that might be really close to them and that might be something they're uncomfortable with. So you may want to veto the clicker for yourself and just use your voice. And if that is the case, I would make sure to recall them, yes, and just have a very consistent vocal tone that you use and just make it very chipper, very happy, and very consistent. Yes, you do not have to use a clicker by any means, but it does actually process through a different part of the brain when you are using a clicker sound as opposed to an actual word, and that causes them to actually learn faster and interpret a more immediate positive association than they do with verbal words. Starting the actual process here, I'm going to opt to have my clicker in my recall hand and my target stick and treats in my other hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for a step up, and the second that he sets his feet onto my hand while he is reaching for the target stick, I'm going to click. I'm not actually going to wait for him to touch the target stick. We are just using the target stick as a means for him to be motivated to step forwards and reach for an object, since he's already motivated to reach for the target stick and touch it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present my step up hand and my target stick kind of like that. So that way he is going to jump forwards and immediately reach for that stick. The goal with my clicker timing is to mark the moment that he steps up onto my hand and not really worrying so much about whether or not he actually does touch the stick. He's just motivated to head towards it. So we notice my clicker timing is happening the exact moment that his feet touch my finger. And he's going to stop wanting to touch the stick quite as much as he begins to isolate that his feet touching is what's being reinforced and not so much actually reaching for the stick. The stick is just the primary motivator to get him to reach forwards and move to a designated location. As we go along with this, we're going to gradually stretch our distance. So right now we're working very, very close where he's just having to do a gentle little hop. Your bird might opt to do a long stretch. Your bird might put their beak onto your finger and reach forwards. Whatever they are comfortable doing. If you have a bird that is clipped, it is very common for them to stretch really, really far over hopping. And this is just because they don't have the confidence to balance properly yet and to land properly yet. So what they're going to do is they're going to stretch out and try to avoid flapping as much as possible because they don't believe that they have the capacity to save themselves if they do fall. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin to present my hand a little bit further away. And I'm not going to go crazy, crazy far. We're sitting at that point where the bird is stretching or comfortable hopping. And now we're going to be exceeding that boundary to where they are going to need to open their wings a little bit, whether that be just to hover or balance or just taking their first big hop. You're just hitting that threshold for where their comfort is. So we want to make sure that we are teetering back and forth, because if you are at that stage where your bird is stretching and they're comfortable jumping, and then you go a little bit further and they're all of a sudden not comfortable at that point, you don't want to keep demanding it and asking it of them because you're asking too much. They're telling you already, I'm uncomfortable doing this. I don't love that you're asking me to do this. I'm kind of scared. I'm uneasy. And they're going to keep failing back to back to back. They're going to keep failing because they're not getting reinforced because you're asking them to jump and they're not comfortable doing it. Once you have hit that threshold where you have hit a distance that you are asking your bird to jump to or stretch to, and they're suddenly not wanting to do it, that is where you're going to start kind of rocking back and forth between your distances. So if right here is where your bird will not jump, but here is where they will, every other rep, you're going to bounce back and forth just like that, because you're going to give them the opportunity to jump. If they tell you, no, I'm not ready, you're going to say, okay, and make it a little bit easier for them. What they're telling you at that point in time is that they're uneasy with the thing that you're asking them for. And for a lot of birds, especially ones that have had their wings clipped, this can mean that they're not confident in their flying skills, or they just straight up lack the muscle control to be able to do it, or the strength to be able to do it. And so by rocking back and forth on that comfort level, you are giving them the opportunity to try and still earn really valuable reinforcement if they do, but you're also making sure that they can still succeed. If you ask your bird to recall back to back to back to back, and it is too difficult for them and they keep refusing to do it, you're creating a situation where now you're adding a lot of conflict and a lot of stress around the thing that you're asking them to do, but you're also setting them up to fail because they've said, no, I'm not comfortable doing it, I'm not capable of doing it yet. And they're not earning any reinforcement every single time that you've asked them to do that recall. And so they're not going to want to, because now there's a lot of stress and a lot of frustration being built up around this behavior. When you teeter back and forth between those comfort levels instead, you are still giving them ample opportunity to earn reinforcement while still pushing those boundaries a little bit and asking them to try a little bit harder if they're open to. When they finally have that breakthrough and decide to go that distance that they didn't want to go before, make sure that you give them something that is super highly valuable. This could be a giant piece of walnut, could be their favorite game, making lots of noise, getting excited, maybe a lot of a treat. You're just wanting to make it really, really valuable because it was hard for them and they finally broke that barrier, they gave it a good try, and that way they are wanting to try doing that again and it was worthwhile. If you're really, really stuck at this point where you're asking your bird to recall a certain distance or you're trying to get that first hop and they're really, really nervous about it, you've had an entire session without even a single time of them managing to do it, I would then consider alternative ways that you could make that easier for them and break it down even more. For a lot of birds, this can mean things like the position of your hand. If my hand is up above the perch, that requires a lot of muscle to actually fly upwards, and that can be more challenging than flying in a straight line. Additionally, some species of birds fly down easier than others. So if I have my hand down here, it's at the further distance, but it's actually still a hop away and they can basically fall the rest of the way. Doesn't require as much flapping, doesn't require as much strength, but again, some birds might find that more difficult. So that's an easy way to experiment and see if that might make them a little bit more confident in trying. Another thing might be putting on a glove. Your hand can be a little slippery if you have a bird, especially who has defects in their feet or maybe just got their nails trimmed. It could be beneficial to have a soft cotton glove on that has a really easy grip. Obviously, make sure your bird is comfortable with the glove first, but that could be a way for them to feel more secure grabbing onto your hand and landing for the first time. A last thing to consider is that jumping and landing on a hand is actually very difficult and very scary for a lot of birds because when they land, you are not a solid, stationary, inanimate object. You are a human being and you move. When you are standing there waiting for them to recall, no matter how still you think you're being, you are moving a little bit. And that can be really intimidating as opposed to landing on a solid, flat perch. And when they do finally land on you, you will sink a little bit. Not dramatically, but there will be a little bit of give. And again, that can be really unnerving for a lot of birds that are new to flying, as that could throw them off balance a little bit and cause them to fall forwards or just slip right off your hand. So you could additionally try doing this exact same process, but with two solid stationary perches instead. That gives them a solid, consistent platform to land on, somewhere they are comfortable and confident walking, and then when they fly and land on it, it isn't going to move around quite as much, and they are confident in their capacity to grip and balance. So once you've gotten through that first jump, the rest of this process is going to go by a lot faster. Getting through that first jump is honestly the biggest hurdle, and as long as they are physically capable of flying the further distances, you shouldn't have too much problem getting further and further recalls from them as your training goes on. Once they realize that it is a possibility again and they are capable of flying again, they're going to be able to do things a lot easier and have a lot more trust in themselves going forwards with the next steps. The next part of this is just going to be increasing your distance a bit more. We're going to keep that target stick in play. We're going to keep our clicker and our recall hand and everything the same. We're just going to be increasing the distance a little bit more. So if they were hopping, now they might be doing one flap. If they were doing one flap, they might be doing two flaps. And we're just working on building a little bit more distance. This is not only going to help the recall behavior for being able to recall from further away, this is going to be working on getting the bird flapping a little bit more and working on building some of that cardio. If your bird has been clipped and this is their first time learning recall with you, they will not be physically fit and will really struggle with as much as 3 or 4 flaps at a time. Especially if you have a bird that does not have all of their wing feathers in yet, they will be very limited on how far they can go physically. And what that means is that you really need to monitor your bird as you are gradually increasing these distances with them. When I'm looking at a bird and deciding whether or not they are capable of flying to the designated distance that I'm working at, I am looking for a few key things in their body language. The first thing I'm going to look for is panting. If I have recalled a bird and they are landing at my hand, their beak is held open and that tongue is bobbing up and down, that is telling me that they are too tired, that was too far, they are not physically capable of doing that distance. It is too much to ask of them, and they need more time at a shorter distance to build up that cardio health, their respiratory health, and their physical strength to be able to reach that distance. The next thing I'm going to look for is the quality of the flight that they did. If they are flying from point A to point B and they're flapping like a madman and they're panicked and they're usually doing this really steep arch where they're kind of jumping as high as they can, flapping like all heck, and then basically plunking straight down onto your hand, that tells you that the bird is either not strong enough or does not have enough feathers to make it to the distance that we are asking them to make. This can be really dangerous because if they don't jump as high as they did in the previous step, they might not make it to your hand and they could plunk straight down to the floor. And that can cause a lot of injuries, a lot of pain, and that is not something we want to have happen. If you have a bird that is fully flighted and is having no problem reaching further distances, you want to watch how many repetitions you're doing back to back. Because if you're asking them to fly back and forth a ton after they've maybe not flown a lot in the past, you are putting a lot of pressure on their heart to perform. And it is going to be exhausting for them, and it can actually cause them to black out in the air if they overexert themselves, and that's obviously something we don't want. So you want to make sure that you're keeping the sessions pretty short. The bird should not be panting, the bird should not be overly fatigued, they should be happy and content and excited to keep going, and you should end your session when they are feeling that way, not when they are overtired and physically exhausted. Now, as you may have noticed, as I described in the beginning, I am presenting my target stick at the same time as my recall hand, and I am clicking for the moment that Newt or Toto lands their feet on my hand, not so much when they actually touch the stick. And what you may have noticed is that they are no longer really acknowledging the stick. They've realized that they're being clicked for landing right on my hand. And at that point, we can basically phase out the target stick because they know it's not really a key factor anymore. It was just there to help them learn the process. And now that they understand that the feet are what's being reinforced, we can begin to phase out that target stick. For some birds, you might be able to just simply take the target stick away completely, present the hand. They'll already know you've been doing recall back to back to back in these sessions, and they'll do it anyways. And then you won't need your target stick there at all. But for other birds, having it suddenly disappear on them can throw them off. So we need to fully phase out the target stick, and there's a few ways that we can help this happen. The first one is to change the order that we are presenting our cues. So at the moment, we have the recall hand and the target stick showing up at the exact same time. When we want to phase out our target stick, we're going to present the recall hand first and the target stick second. And what's going to happen is a bird really wants to earn their reinforcer, they really want to get that treat, so they're going to start looking for the fastest way and the fastest cue, the first thing that tells them that a recall needs to happen in order to get that treat as quickly as possible. So when we change the sequence, so now the recall hand is coming before the target stick, they're going to start noticing that consistency and start to recall before the target stick even shows up. And when that happens, you're going to want to jackpot that moment, give them all the treats in the world, and keep practicing that. If you present your recall hand, you wait half a second and they don't recall, then I would present the stick following that to encourage them to follow through with the behavior. Over time, they will become consistent in jumping onto your hand without the presence of the target stick. You may also find it helpful to gradually hide the target stick with each time that you present it. So you start off having it fully open, and then I like to extend my pointer finger so it looks like an extension of the stick itself. And then with each repetition, you can kind of hide it behind your pinky or your pointer finger a little bit more each time until you can fully drop it out of the equation, and then it's just your hand being there, and that can help them not rely on the stick quite as much. And then the same thing, you would present your hand, then the point, present your hand, then the point, waiting a little bit more time in between your recall hand and the point each time, and then slowly you will no longer need that hand anymore as they become reliant on the recall hand that they're landing on over the target stick or the pointer finger at play. This is basically the entire basics of recall. That's how you teach a bird to come to you when called. In order to build off of this behavior and make it work in a variety of situations, I would then take this practice spot, build up more and more distance, build up their stamina and their cardio health until they're able to fly across the length of a room. Then you can start doing fun things like applying it into the rest of your house, so that way they will be able to recall off of cabinets and stuff like that. So you'll start from your standard perch and you can recall more vertically, you can recall more downwards and get those muscles working, get them comfortable flying and descending, getting all of the strength needed for that. And then when you are taking this and wanting to apply it into the rest of your house, it's important to remember that just because they understand how something works on this perch doesn't mean that they understand how it's going to work out in the rest of your home. So it's actually important to actually place them on top of your cabinets or your counters, wherever you think they're going to land, and have the same drills, practice recalling with the little hops and the gradual more distances, the inclines and the declines on those cabinets in those different places so they can build confidence, and so that way they can understand how to recall from all of those different situations. The more places you practice in, the more consistent and reliable your recall will get, and the better it will be. If you would like to also add a verbal cue onto your recall, so that way you are able to practice things like out-of-sight recalls or getting their attention, you can easily add on a verbal cue by the end of the process. So you don't want to be adding in a verbal cue right at the start when the bird is trying to analyze what you want from them. It adds a lot of noise to the environment, can make it very confusing. So when we want to add a verbal cue onto our recall, what we're going to do is wait until the bird fully understands the concept, they're able to recall to just the presentation of our hand and nothing else. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say our verbal cue at the exact same time as the presentation of our hand. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause them to connect those two things together the first time. They're going to hear the word, they're going to do the action back to back. And that's going to become a pattern where they hear the word and do the action all at the exact same time. There's no confusion in between, there's no gaps of time in between, there's no mistakes that can happen in between. You are saying it the moment that they're doing that action. The more that you say that word and have them practice the behavior, the more they're going to understand how that word relates to the behavior that you would like them to do. And then you can begin to put the word right before the cue. So you could say the word, then present your hand, and then the bird will begin to recall, and then you go from there. And this creates a situation now where if you happen to be out of sight and the bird cannot visibly see your hand signal, you can call their name, they will know, oh, that means I'm supposed to recall, and then when they whip around the corner to find you, they will see your recall hand waiting and can complete the action. And that is really it for teaching your bird the basics of recall. You can have so much fun with this, and you can really teach them to do a variety of fun things with recall, whether that be learning to fly straight down your stairs or shoot up on really steep inclines. You can teach them to land on you while you are moving, or come and seek you out while you are hiding around a corner. There are all sorts of ways to build upon this and have a lot of fun with it. The more you practice it, the more ways you practice it, and the more places you practice it in will create a more reliable and consistent recall. But that will do it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!